I recently just finished reading a book called Viking Age Iceland by Jesse Byock. I've been a big fan of his. He's known for translating a lot of the Icelandic sagas in the past decade or so, and writing a few books, and I think he's been in a few documentaries as well. In the book, he goes through some of the Icelandic sagas and forms a coherent understanding of how the medieval society functioned. In this video, I'm going to try to briefly explain the Commonwealth or Free State era of Iceland. I'm going to look at it from a political perspective, or maybe you could say a governmental perspective, something that was only briefly mentioned in the book. It was definitely there though. So I wanted to do my own take on it and put it in my own words. Iceland was first settled in the late 800s and early 900s, mainly by Norwegians. Actually, I shouldn't say first settled, I should say first settled by non-Celtic people. In the sagas, it's implied that the settlers were fleeing their king, and the king was Harald Fairhair, who was the first king of the new unified Norway. I've actually seen some speculation saying that Harald Fairhair did not exist as the sagas portrayed him, but I guess that's beside the point. Many of the settlers of Iceland came from one part of Norway or another, and it's evident that these settlers chose to keep some aspects of Norwegian governing, specifically some practices of Old Germanic law. Old Germanic law stems from thousands of years earlier. Romans actually came in contact with them, with people practicing Old Germanic law. They, of course, rejected some aspects of their foreign home as well, especially the authoritative, monarchical aspects, which is why you don't see a king of Iceland. It may have not been that much of a decision for how the settler society worked out. It could be thought that they rejected the top-down control of most of mainland Europe at the time, and they wanted a more simplistic or maybe even individualistic society. But these communities were not really planned, at least in my point of view. They came naturally as these voyagers would settle down in an area and make beneficial alliances with others. These communities would pop up on every side of the island, and eventually they would have a political leader or a chieftain called a Gothi. A Gothi could come into power in a few different ways, one of which would be the passing of the position to a family member, and this wasn't necessarily always the firstborn son or anything like that. It could be anyone. This is why they also give it to a gift to some friends or someone who's done them a favor. Someone could also buy their way into the position, and none of these necessarily meant that the Gothi had to give up their position, because multiple people could be the leader of a group. Now, this doesn't seem very democratic if you ask me. I don't think it was, but it does look like most of the time the transition to a Gothi was peaceful, and the Thingmen, who were the common people or followers, consented to this leadership. You may be thinking, well, of course they consented to the leadership of the Gothi. What other choices do they have? And that is a good question. That's my exact criticism as well. From the sources I looked at, it appears to be a common position to believe that the Thingmen of Iceland were free to associate with any community they wished. This was sort of a checks and balances system, so the leaders would not get too much power. It could be looked at as a mutualistic relationship between the chieftains and their followers. Of course, if a chieftain is being aggressive to their followers, or let's just say unlikable in the slightest, the followers would have the option of moving somewhere else and settling with another Gothi. But really, we don't know how realistic this is or how idealistic this is. The Gothi got their wealth from their own farms, sometimes with slaves, and sometimes they would have propertyless Thingmen working on them. They would also rent property, and they were rewarded for solving certain disputes for their Thingmen. So there is no evidence of frequent taxation, which might make a lot of people happy. With everything I've explained so far, Iceland does not look like it has much of a government at all. It's only people organizing themselves into small tribe-like groups to make things easier. This is true, but the most important job of the Gothar, which is the plural for Gothi, would be at something called the Things. These were something that the Icelanders wanted to keep from Norway and their Germanic ancestors. A thing was an assembly of leaders and free people from a certain region, and they spawned the whole way back from ancient Gaul and Germania, but most likely they were around way before this. At one point, Iceland was divided into 4 regions, and all these regions would have their own things. The largest and most important thing in Iceland was the Althing. This was the grand gathering of the Icelandic people, and it took place every June at Thingvellir. The parliament of the Althing was composed of the Gothar, and they would create new laws, and they would also amend old laws, as a parliament would do. The Gothar also appointed a national law speaker, or lagskoðsmann, to recite the current laws to the people. There was also a court system that had a judicial body that was appointed by the Gothar. They would decide if the perpetrator is innocent or guilty, but would let the victim, or the victim's family, if they were not alive or present, decide the punishment of the guilty. The Free State of Iceland is not an anarchy, as many anarchists like to claim. It's true that there is a government, and it is a centralized government, even if it only consists of the Gothar, the law speaker, and the judicial body. I always want to look at the Free State of Iceland as a federation of self-functioning clans or microstates, because the individual clans do have their own internal anarchic autonomy and control, but maybe that isn't the best way to look at it, because there is no real mention of shared powers. But then again, the central government never dabbled into any of the functioning of the individual communities. I don't know. This is just me trying to make sense of it out loud, because Iceland had such an unparalleled form of government. I'm not a political scientist, and I'm curious to what other people would think about this. When I was reading this book, Viking Age Iceland, it seemed that the Thingmen had it pretty good. It wasn't a democracy as we would think of one today, but it was certainly a proto-democracy, which was a whole lot better than what the rest of Europe was suffering through. When I was researching Iceland, I came across so many articles and forums that were talking about how Iceland was the ideal libertarian utopia. I just want to address this really quick. It may have mentioned this in the book, I don't remember for sure, but what you have to remember is that there was no police force, no central or even local executive powers to enforce the laws and to make sure the Gothi are loyal to the people. And of course, that is going to sound great to some libertarians, but I would argue that you would be an anarchist and not a libertarian if you believe in this, because the system doesn't even fit under the classification of minarchist government or a night watchman state, which many perceive to be the most minimal form of government. But of course, this was not anarchy either, as I mentioned earlier with the centralized government. So I take my comment back. If you believe in this, I can't think of any other word than a medieval Icelandist to label you as. But I don't like this type of government, and that is because that this type of government allowed for a period called the Age of Sturlungs. Now, I don't want to get too much into this because I could do an entirely separate video about it. Essentially, the Age of Sturlungs was a period in the late Commonwealth era when certain Gothar were persuaded by the King of Norway to help him bring Iceland into the sovereignty of the kingdom. This started up trouble throughout the island and created essentially a civil war, and eventually in 1264, I think, Iceland signed away its freedom to Norway. And of course, it was this type of government that allowed foreign governments to take control of the island. There was nothing stopping the Gothar from foreign influences and bribery. In conclusion, I think the Icelandic Free State is just above what would be considered a government. At heart, I think it was an extreme libertarian society, so much so that it is bordering on anarchism. But it doesn't necessarily fit either of these definitions. I do not think it would be very easy to have a government like this in the modern world, mostly because we are not all farmers, and civilization is much more complex than it ever has been. And of course, we have specialized jobs and specialized interests. However, if I ever hear of news of something starting like this, a small group planning to live like the Icelandic Vikings, I will hold a great interest, because I do think that we can learn a lot from Viking Age Iceland. Okay, I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you have any disagreements, I'd like you to leave a comment, and we could have a nice civil discussion down below. Now, this is my first video like this, and I plan to make many more. I guess what I'm going for is a individualistic take on history.